Bound by true love. Lady Isabel of Westmere had spent months fleeing from the king's men, always a step ahead. But when Sir Gareth Fitzrohan finally caught her, he did not strike her down. Instead, he tilted his head, watching her. "You are a difficult woman to catch, my lady," he murmured. "Shall we see if you are just as difficult to keep?" Chapter 1. The Falcon's Flight. The wind whipped at Lady Isabel's cloak, a fierce, biting wind that mirrored the turmoil within her. It tore at the edges of the thick, wool fabric, the gray dyed a shade darker by the relentless drizzle that had been falling since dawn. She urged her mare, a sturdy, dappled gray named Whisper, onward, pushing the animal to its limits across the sodden moorland. The ground was treacherous, sucking at the horse's hooves, a constant threat of a fall that could mean capture, or worse. Isabel risked a glance over her shoulder. The distant, rolling hills were shrouded in mist, a swirling, gray curtain that offered a fragile veil of concealment. But she knew they were there. The king's men. Relentless, unwavering, their pursuit a chilling testament to King Edmund's unwavering wrath. She could almost feel their eyes on her, burning into her back, even from this distance. It had been 3 moons since she had fled Westmere, her ancestral home, a fortress of stone and history nestled in the heart of the northern valleys. 3 moons since she had defied the king's decree, a decree that would have bound her in marriage to Lord Beaumont, a cruel, ambitious man whose touch sent shivers of revulsion down her spine. A man whose loyalty to the king was surpassed only by his hunger for power and for Westmere's strategic position. Isabel had chosen flight over submission, freedom over a gilded cage. She had traded the silks and jewels of her station for rough-spun wool and the constant companionship of fear. She had exchanged the warmth of the hearth for the chilling dampness of the open moors, the laughter of her household for the mournful cry of the wind. She had known the risks. Disobeying the king was treason, punishable by imprisonment or death. But the thought of Beaumont's hands on her, the thought of surrendering her autonomy, her very self, to his whims, was a fate far more terrifying. Whisper stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Isabel pulled gently on the reins, slowing the mare to a walk. "Easy, girl," she murmured, her voice hoarse from the cold and the constant strain. "Just a little further." She reached into the worn leather satchel slung across her shoulder, pulling out a small, water skin. She took a long draught, the cold water a welcome relief to her parched throat. She offered some to Whisper, who drank gratefully. The landscape was bleak, desolate. Twisted, gnarled trees clawed at the sky, their branches bare and skeletal. Jagged rocks jutted out from the earth, like the teeth of some ancient beast. The only sound was the relentless drumming of the rain and the mournful sigh of the wind. Isabel had been following the old shepherd's trails, paths known only to those who lived and breathed the land. They were treacherous, winding routes, but they offered the best chance of avoiding the king's patrols, who favored the well-trodden roads. She thought of her brother, Thomas, the current lord of Westmere. He had pleaded with her to obey the king's command, to accept Beaumont as her husband. He had spoken of duty, of family honor, of the need to secure Westmere's future. But Isabel had seen the fear in his eyes, the fear of the king's displeasure, the fear of losing everything. She had loved Thomas, had always looked up to him, but she couldn't understand his willingness to sacrifice her happiness, her freedom, for the sake of political expediency. Had their father, the old lord, been alive, he would have never forced such choice upon his daughter. A sudden, sharp pain pierced Isabel's chest. Grief, a constant companion these past months, threatened to overwhelm her. She closed her eyes, fighting back the tears. She couldn't afford to weep. Not now. Not ever. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. She had to be strong. For herself. For the memory of her father. For the hope, however faint, that she could one day reclaim her life, her home. As the day wore on, the mist thickened, swirling around her like a ghostly shroud. Visibility dropped to near zero. Isabel slowed Whisper to a cautious walk, relying on the mare's instincts to guide them through the treacherous terrain. She strained her ears, listening for any sound that might betray the presence of her pursuers. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the rhythmic thud of Whisper's hooves and the whisper of the wind. Suddenly, Whisper stopped, her ears pricked, her body tense. Isabel felt a surge of adrenaline, her heart pounding against her ribs. She reached for the small, hunting knife hidden beneath her cloak, her hand trembling slightly. A shape emerged from the mist, a dark, looming figure on horseback. Isabel held her breath, her eyes fixed on the approaching rider. The figure drew closer, resolving into the form of a man, clad in a heavy, dark cloak, his face obscured by the shadows of his hood. He reined in his horse a few feet from Isabel, his mount a magnificent, black stallion that dwarfed Whisper. The stallion snorted, its breath forming white clouds in the cold air. The man remained silent, his gaze fixed on Isabel. She met his stare, her chin lifted in defiance. She wouldn't cower. She wouldn't beg. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "Lady Isabel of Westmere," he said, the words heavy with a weariness that surprised her. "You have led us on a merry chase." Isabel's grip tightened on her knife. "I have no desire to be chased," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "I seek only to be free." The man chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Freedom is a luxury few can afford, my lady. Especially those who defy the king." He shifted in his saddle, his hand moving towards the hilt of the sword that hung at his side. Isabel tensed, ready to defend herself, even though she knew it was a futile gesture. He was a seasoned warrior, clad in armor beneath his cloak, while she was a woman alone, armed only with a small knife. But he didn't draw his sword. Instead, he simply looked at her, his eyes, now visible in the fading light, a startling shade of gray, piercing and intense. "I am Sir Gareth Fitzrohan," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle, "and I have been sent to bring you back to King Edmund." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her worn clothing, her tired eyes, the defiant set of her jaw. "You are a difficult woman to catch, my lady," he murmured, a hint of something akin to admiration in his voice. "Shall we see if you are just as difficult to keep?" The question hung in the air, a challenge, a promise, and a threat, all intertwined. The mist seemed to press closer, as if holding its breath, waiting for her answer, for her fate to be decided in this desolate, windswept place. Chapter 2. Shadows of the King's Decree. The weight of Sir Gareth's words settled upon Isabel like the damp, heavy mist that clung to the moors. Difficult to keep. The phrase echoed in her mind, a subtle taunt, a veiled threat. It spoke of a confinement not of iron bars, but of watchful eyes and unyielding will. She met his gray gaze, refusing to betray the fear that gnawed at her insides. "I am no one's to keep, Sir Knight," she retorted, her voice tight with defiance. She shifted her weight, subtly positioning herself to be ready to bolt if the opportunity arose, though she knew the chances of outrunning his powerful stallion were slim. Gareth Fitzrohan studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the mournful cry of a distant bird and the steady drip of rain from the brim of his hood. He was a formidable figure, even sitting astride his horse. Broad shoulders strained against the fabric of his dark cloak, and she could sense the strength coiled beneath, a warrior's power held in check. "The king's decree is clear, Lady Isabel," he finally said, his voice devoid of any inflection that might betray his personal feelings on the matter. "You are to be wed to Lord Beaumont. Your defiance is unwise." Isabel's jaw tightened. "Unwise?" she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "To refuse a forced marriage to a cruel and ambitious man? To choose freedom over a life of misery? Is that unwise, Sir Knight, or is it simply human?" A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or even respect crossed Gareth's features. He hadn't expected such boldness, such open defiance from a woman who was, for all intents and purposes, his captive. He dismounted, the movement fluid and graceful despite the weight of his armor. He stood before her, towering over her, yet he made no move to touch her, to restrain her. He simply watched her, his gray eyes intense and unwavering. "The king sees it as treason," he said softly, his gaze searching hers. "And treason has consequences." Isabel knew the consequences all too well. She had seen them play out in the lives of others who had dared to cross King Edmund. Imprisonment, torture, even death. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but she refused to let it show. "I am not a traitor," she said, her voice firm. "I have committed no crime save refusing to be a pawn in the king's game." Gareth inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her point. Perhaps he conceded. "But the king's word is law, and I am sworn to uphold that law." He gestured towards his horse. "Come, Lady Isabel. Let us end this chase. It benefits neither of us."
Isabel Gesetatit.
Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear into the mist, to fight for her freedom until her last breath. But she also knew it was futile. She was exhausted, her horse was spent, and she was no match for this seasoned knight. And yet there was something in his eyes, something beyond the cold duty of a king's man, that gave her pause. A hint of weariness, perhaps a flicker of understanding. Or was she simply imagining it, grasping at straws in her desperation? She thought of Westmere, of her brother, of the people who depended on her. If she continued to run, to defy the king, it would only bring more hardship upon them. Perhaps there was another way. A way to fight for her freedom from within the confines of the king's court. A way to use her wits, her intelligence, to navigate the treacherous currents of power. It was a dangerous gamble, a desperate hope. But it was the only chance she had. "I will go with you, Sir Knight," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "But I will not surrender my spirit. I will not be broken." Gareth studied her for a moment longer, his gray eyes searching hers. He seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her resolve. "So be it," he finally said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Then let us see what spirit you possess, Lady Isabel. Let us see if it is strong enough to withstand the shadows of the king's decree." He offered her his hand, a gesture of assistance, not of capture. Isabel hesitated for a fraction of a second, then placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, strong, but surprisingly gentle. A warmth spread through her cold fingers, a fleeting moment of human connection in the midst of this desolate landscape. He helped her onto his stallion, settling her in front of him. The horse was warm, its powerful muscles rippling beneath her. She could feel Gareth's body close behind hers, a protective presence, yet also a constant reminder of her captivity. As they rode, the mist began to dissipate, revealing the rugged beauty of the moors. The rain had stopped, and a pale sun peeked through the clouds, casting long shadows across the land. Isabel found herself stealing glances at Gareth, studying the strong lines of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He was a handsome man, she realized, a man who carried himself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. But he was also the king's man, her captor, and she couldn't afford to forget that. They rode in silence for a long time, the only sound the rhythmic thud of the stallion's hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Isabel found herself lost in thought, replaying the events that had led her to this moment. She thought of her father, the late Lord of Westmere, a strong, just man who had taught her to value freedom and independence. He had encouraged her to learn to ride, to hunt, to wield a sword, skills that were considered unconventional for a noblewoman. He had instilled in her a sense of self-worth, a belief in her own abilities. He would be ashamed, she thought with sadness, to see her now, a fugitive, hunted by the king's men. But would also be ashamed if she was married with Lord Beaumont? She believed in his heart. He wanted her to be free, not trapped. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple. The beauty of the landscape was a stark contrast to the turmoil within Isabel's heart. As darkness fell, they reached the edge of the moors, a small, isolated village nestled in the shadow of a towering cliff. Gareth guided his horse towards a modest inn, the only sign of life in the otherwise deserted village. "We will rest here for the night," he said, his voice low, "and continue our journey in the morning." Isabel nodded, her heart heavy with apprehension. The journey to the king's court was long, and she knew that the challenges ahead would be far greater than anything she had faced so far. She was entering a world of intrigue, of power struggles, of hidden agendas. A world where her very survival would depend on her wits, her courage, and her ability to navigate the treacherous shadows of the king's decree. The inn's flickering candlelight seemed to offer little warmth against the encroaching darkness, a darkness that mirrored the uncertainty of her future. Chapter 3. The Hunter's Snare. The inn, the weary traveler, was as humble as its name suggested. Low-ceilinged and smelling of damp wood and stale ale, it offered little in the way of comfort. A single, flickering oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls, illuminating a handful of rough-looking patrons huddled around a crackling fire. They glanced up as Gareth and Isabel entered, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Gareth, seemingly unfazed by their stares, led Isabel to a small, secluded table in the corner. He spoke quietly to the innkeeper, a stout, balding man with a wary expression, and secured a private room for the night. The transaction was brief, conducted with the efficiency of a man accustomed to command. Isabel sat stiffly, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt the weight of the patrons' gazes, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. She was a lady, clearly out of place in this rough establishment, and her presence with the imposing knight undoubtedly fueled speculation. Gareth returned, placing a tankard of ale before her and a plate of bread and cheese. "Eat," he said, his voice devoid of any command, more of a suggestion. "You need your strength." Isabel looked at the food, her stomach churning with a mixture of hunger and anxiety. She hadn't eaten properly in days, living on meager rations scavenged from the land. But the thought of eating, of showing any vulnerability in front of her captor, made her hesitate. Gareth sat opposite her, watching her with his unnervingly perceptive gray eyes. He took a long draught of his own ale, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You needn't fear poison, Lady Isabel," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I have no desire to harm you. The king wants you alive, and well, I find myself strangely disinclined to deliver him a corpse." Isabel met his gaze, searching for any sign of deception. She found none. There was a weariness in his eyes, a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher, but there was no malice. She took a small bite of the bread, chewing slowly, savoring the simple taste. The ale was bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out. She ate in silence, Gareth watching her, his expression unreadable. As she ate, she tried to gather her thoughts, to formulate a plan. She was trapped for now, but she wouldn't be defeated. She would use this journey, this forced proximity to Gareth, to her advantage. She would learn everything she could about him, about the king's court, about the political landscape. She would find a way to turn the tables, to escape the hunter's snare. "Tell me, Sir Knight," she said, finally breaking the silence, "why did you pursue me so relentlessly? Surely there are other matters of greater importance to the king than a runaway bride." Gareth leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the fire. "You underestimate your importance, Lady Isabel," he said. "Westmere is a strategic holding. Its loyalty to the crown is essential. And my marriage to Lord Beaumont is the key to that loyalty?" Isabel asked, her voice laced with bitterness. Gareth nodded. "Beaumont is a powerful man, a loyal servant of the king. Your union would solidify his allegiance and secure the northern border." "And what are my wishes?" Isabel asked, her voice rising slightly. "Do they count for nothing?" Gareth looked at her, his gray eyes softening. "In the king's eyes? No," he said frankly, "but perhaps not all at court share his view." Isabel's heart quickened. A glimmer of hope, a faint possibility that she might find allies within the king's court. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who would dare to oppose the king's will?" Gareth hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "There are whispers," he said. "Rumors of discontent. But it is dangerous to speak of such things, even here." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "The king is not well," he said. "His grip on power is weakening. There are those who believe he is no longer fit to rule." Isabel's mind raced. This was dangerous information, treasonous even to hear. But it also presented an opportunity. If the king's power was truly waning, there might be a chance to challenge his decree, to find a way to avoid the forced marriage. "And you, Sir Knight?" she asked, her voice low and intense. "Where do your loyalties lie?" Gareth met her gaze, his gray eyes unwavering. "I am sworn to serve the king," he said. "But I am also sworn to uphold justice. And sometimes those two oaths are not easily reconciled." He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "It is late," he said. "We should rest. We have a long journey ahead of us." He led her to the private room, a small, sparsely furnished chamber with a single bed and a narrow window overlooking the dark, silent village. The air was cold and damp, and the only light came from a single, flickering candle. Isabel felt a wave of vulnerability wash over her. She was alone with her captor, in a strange place, far from everything she knew and loved. Gareth sensed her unease. He placed a hand on her arm, a brief, reassuring touch. "You will be safe here, Lady Isabel," he said, his voice gentle. "I give you my word." He hesitated, then added, "I will sleep outside your door. No harm will come to you this night." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her. "Try to rest," he said. "You will need your strength for what lies ahead." He closed the door behind him, leaving Isabel alone in the dimly lit room. She stood for a moment, listening to the sound of his footsteps receding down the corridor. She walked to the window, looking out at the dark, silent village. The wind howled outside, a mournful sound that mirrored the turmoil within her heart. She was trapped, caught in the hunter's snare. But she was not defeated. She would find a way to escape, to reclaim her freedom. She would use her wits, her courage, and the unexpected complexities of her captor to navigate the treacherous path ahead. The candle flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the wall, a silent testament to her determination to survive, to fight, to live. She knew one wrong step, and she could lose everything. Chapter 4. A Cage of Gilded Iron. The journey to King Edmund's court was arduous, a seemingly endless trek across windswept plains, through dense forests, and over treacherous mountain passes. Each day blurred into the next, marked only by the changing landscape and the growing tension that simmered between Isabel and Gareth. They spoke little, their conversations confined to the necessities of travel. Yet a strange sort of understanding began to develop between them. Isabel observed Gareth closely, noticing the way he cared for his horse, the quiet efficiency with which he set up camp each night, the subtle signs of weariness that etched lines around his eyes. He was a man of duty, of discipline, but she sensed a deep-seated conflict within him, a struggle between his loyalty to the king and his own sense of justice. Gareth, in turn, seemed equally intrigued by Isabel. He watched her as she rode, her back straight, her chin held high, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He saw the resilience in her eyes, the unwavering determination that belied her vulnerable position. He admired her courage, her refusal to be cowed by her circumstances. One evening, as they sat by a crackling fire, sharing a simple meal of roasted rabbit and dried fruit, Gareth broke the silence. "You remind me of someone," he said, his voice thoughtful, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Isabel looked at him, curious. "Who?" He hesitated, a shadow passing over his face. "My sister," he said softly. "She was spirited, like you. Defiant. She refused an arranged marriage as well." Isabel's heart quickened. What happened to her? Gareth's jaw tightened. "She fled," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She was never found." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Isabel understood the pain, the loss, that lay beneath his stoic exterior. She saw the guilt in his eyes, the unspoken question of whether he could have done more to protect her. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine empathy. Gareth looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice rough. "But some wounds never fully heal." They sat in silence for a long time, the crackling fire the only sound between them. Isabel felt a connection to Gareth, a shared understanding of loss and regret. She realized that he was not simply her captor, but a man with his own burdens, his own scars. As the days passed, Isabel began to notice subtle changes in Gareth's behavior. He became less guarded, more willing to engage in conversation. He spoke of his childhood, of his training as a knight, of the battles he had fought. He shared his thoughts on the political landscape, the growing unrest within the kingdom, the whispers of discontent surrounding King Edmund. He never explicitly criticized the king, but Isabel sensed his growing disillusionment. He spoke of the need for justice, for fairness, for a ruler who valued the well-being of his people. One afternoon, as they rode through a dense forest, Gareth pointed to a towering oak tree, its branches reaching towards the sky like gnarled fingers. "My father used to bring me here," he said, his voice wistful. "He taught me to hunt, to ride, to fight. He taught me the importance of honor, of loyalty, of courage." He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "He would be disappointed in me," he said softly. Isabel looked at him, surprised.
"Why?"
Gareth sighed. "Because I have become a tool of the king," he said. "A man who enforces unjust laws, who carries out orders that go against my conscience." He turned to her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of anger and self-reproach. "I am sworn to serve the king," he said. "But I am beginning to question whether that oath is worth the price of my soul." Isabel felt a surge of hope. Gareth's words were a confirmation of her suspicions, a sign that he was not simply a blind follower of the king. He was a man of conscience, a man who was struggling to reconcile his duty with his own sense of right and wrong. "There is always a choice, Sir Knight," she said, her voice firm. "You are not bound to follow orders that violate your conscience. You can choose to do what is right, even if it means defying the king." Gareth looked at her, his expression a mixture of admiration and despair. "It is not so simple, Lady Isabel," he said. "The consequences of defiance are severe. I have seen what happens to those who oppose the king. But is it not better to die with honor than to live with shame?" Isabel asked, her voice passionate. Gareth was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on hers. He seemed to be weighing her words, considering the implications. "Perhaps," he finally said, his voice low. "Perhaps you are right." As they continued their journey, Isabel felt a growing sense of hope. She had found an unexpected ally in her captor, a man who was beginning to question his own loyalty to the king. She knew that the road ahead would be dangerous, that the challenges they faced would be formidable. But she was no longer alone. She had Gareth, a knight whose conscience was awakening, a man who might just be willing to risk everything to help her fight for her freedom. The walls of the king's castle loomed in the distance, a symbol of the gilded cage that awaited her. But for the first time in a long time, Isabel felt a flicker of defiance ignite within her, fueled by the unexpected alliance forged in the heart of her captivity. The journey had changed them both, and the castle held its breath. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Stone Halls. The king's castle was a formidable sight, a sprawling fortress of gray stone that dominated the landscape. Towers pierced the sky, their battlements bristling with archers. Thick walls, scarred by centuries of warfare, encircled a vast courtyard teeming with soldiers, servants, and courtiers. It was a city within a city, a microcosm of the kingdom, a place of power, intrigue, and hidden dangers. As Isabel and Gareth rode through the massive gates, she felt a wave of apprehension wash over her. This was the heart of the king's power, the place where her fate would be decided. She was a prisoner, an enemy of the crown, entering a lion's den. Gareth, sensing her unease, leaned closer. "Keep your head high, Lady Isabel," he murmured. "Show no fear. They will be watching you." His words were a reminder of the constant scrutiny she would be under, the ever-present danger of betrayal. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and met the gazes of the curious onlookers with a mask of defiance. They were escorted to a small, sparsely furnished chamber in the guest wing of the castle. It was a far cry from the luxurious accommodations she had enjoyed at Westmere, but it was clean and private, a small sanctuary in this vast, intimidating fortress. "You will be confined here until the king summons you," Gareth said, his voice formal. He hesitated, then added, "I will endeavor to ensure your comfort." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her. His gray eyes, usually so guarded, held a flicker of concern. "Be careful, Lady Isabel," he said softly. "This place is full of whispers. Trust no one." His words were a chilling warning, a reminder of the treacherous currents that flowed beneath the surface of courtly life. She was surrounded by enemies, by those who would benefit from her downfall. After Gareth left, Isabel explored her chamber. It was small, but it had a large window that offered a breathtaking view of the castle grounds and the surrounding countryside. She stood by the window for a long time, gazing out at the rolling hills, the distant forests, the shimmering river that snaked its way through the valley. She longed for the freedom of the open road, for the simple life she had left behind. But she knew she couldn't dwell on the past. She had to focus on the present, on surviving in this dangerous environment. She had to be strong, resourceful, and cunning. She unpacked her meager belongings, arranging them neatly in the small chest that stood at the foot of the bed. She had managed to salvage a few precious items from Westmere, a silver locket containing a miniature portrait of her father, a worn copy of her favorite book of poetry, and a small, silver dagger, a gift from her brother, Thomas. The dagger was a reminder of her resolve, of her determination to fight for her freedom. She held it in her hand, feeling the cool metal against her skin, the weight of it a source of comfort and strength. As the day wore on, Isabel began to feel the isolation of her confinement. The silence of the chamber was oppressive, broken only by the occasional sounds of activity from the courtyard below. She longed for human contact, for someone to talk to, someone to confide in. But she knew she couldn't trust anyone. Not yet. She had to be cautious, observant, to learn the rules of this game before she made any moves. In the late afternoon, a servant arrived with a tray of food, roasted chicken, bread, cheese, and a flagon of wine. The food was surprisingly good, a welcome change from the meager fare she had been eating on the journey. As she ate, she thought of Gareth. He had been true to his word, ensuring her comfort, at least to the extent that he could. She wondered about his motives, about the conflict that she sensed within him. Was he truly an ally, or was he simply playing a part, waiting for the opportune moment to betray her? She finished her meal, then paced the room, restless and anxious. She needed information. She needed to understand the dynamics of the court, the alliances, the rivalries, the weaknesses of her enemies. She decided to take a risk. She opened the door to her chamber and stepped out into the corridor. It was dimly lit, the only light coming from flickering torches mounted on the stone walls. The air was cold and damp, and the silence was unnerving. She walked slowly down the corridor, her ears straining for any sound. She passed several closed doors, each one a mystery, a potential source of danger or opportunity. Suddenly, she heard voices, muffled whispers coming from behind one of the doors. She paused, her heart pounding. She pressed her ear against the cold stone, listening intently. She could only make out fragments of the conversation, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine.
Lady Isabel.
Dangerous. Beaumont. Demands. King's favor. Waning. Rebellion. Brewing. Isabel stepped back from the door, her mind racing. The whispers confirmed her fears, but also offered a glimmer of hope. The king's power was weakening, there was talk of rebellion, and Lord Beaumont was clearly concerned about her presence at court. She had to find a way to exploit this situation, to turn the tables on her enemies. She had to find allies, those who shared her opposition to the king and to Beaumont. But she had to be careful. One wrong move, one misplaced word, could cost her everything. She returned to her chamber, her mind buzzing with possibilities, with plans, with the daunting realization that she was a pawn in a much larger game, a game where the stakes were not just her freedom, but the fate of the kingdom itself. The stone walls seemed to press in on her, a constant reminder of the whispers, the secrets, the dangers that lurked in every shadow of the king's court. She was trapped, but she was not defeated, and tonight, she was starting a plan. Chapter 6. The Price of Defiance. The summons came the following morning, delivered by a stern-faced guard with the royal crest emblazoned on his tunic. Isabel had expected it, had spent the night preparing herself, mentally rehearsing her arguments, steeling her resolve. Yet, as she followed the guard through the labyrinthine corridors of the castle, a knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. She was led to a large, opulent chamber, the king's audience hall. Sunlight streamed through tall, arched windows, illuminating intricate tapestries that depicted scenes of battles and conquests. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the murmur of hushed voices. Courtiers, dressed in silks and velvets, lined the walls, their eyes fixed on Isabel as she entered. At the far end of the hall, seated on a raised dais, was King Edmund. He was an imposing figure, even in his advanced age. His once powerful frame was now stooped, his face lined with wrinkles, his eyes a cold, piercing blue filled with a mixture of weariness and suspicion. He was flanked by his advisors, among them Lord Beaumont, whose cruel, calculating gaze sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. Isabel approached the dais, her head held high, her steps measured. She curtsied deeply, a gesture of respect, but her eyes met the king's without flinching. Lady Isabel of Westmere, the king said, his voice raspy, his tone laced with displeasure. You have defied my decree. You have fled your betrothed. You have committed treason. Isabel stood tall, her voice clear and steady. Your Majesty, she said, I have committed no treason. I have simply exercised my right to choose my own destiny. I will not be forced into a marriage against my will. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the court. Such open defiance was unheard of, especially from a woman. The king's eyes narrowed. You're right? He repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You have no rights, Lady Isabel, save those I grant you. You are my subject, and you will obey my commands. I am your subject, Your Majesty, Isabel replied, but I am also a human being, with my own mind, my own heart, my own soul. I will not be treated as a chattel, a prize to be awarded to the highest bidder. Lord Beaumont stepped forward, his face contorted with anger. She is insolent, Your Majesty, he said, his voice smooth and venomous. She deserves to be punished. Isabel turned to face him, her eyes flashing with contempt. You speak of punishment, Lord Beaumont? She said. You, who would force me into a marriage I despise. You, who would use me to further your own ambitions. Beaumont's face turned crimson. He opened his mouth to retort, but the king raised a hand, silencing him. Enough, the king said, his voice weary. I have heard enough of this bickering. He looked at Isabel, his gaze piercing. You are a stubborn woman, Lady Isabel, he said. But stubbornness can be broken. I offer you one last chance. Accept Lord Beaumont as your husband, and all will be forgiven. Refuse, and you will face the consequences. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest. She knew the consequences all too well. Imprisonment, torture, even death. But she couldn't surrender. She couldn't betray her own principles, her own heart. I cannot, Your Majesty, she said, her voice firm. I will not marry Lord Beaumont. I would rather face death than a life of misery at his side. A gasp of shock echoed through the hall. The courtiers stared at Isabel, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fear. They had never witnessed such blatant defiance of the king's will. The king's face hardened. He leaned forward, his eyes blazing with anger. So be it, he said, his voice cold and final. You have made your choice. You will be imprisoned in the tower until you come to your senses. And if you do not, he left the threat hanging in the air, unspoken but understood. Isabel felt a wave of despair wash over her. The tower. a place of darkness, of isolation, of despair, a place from which few ever returned. But she wouldn't show her fear. She wouldn't give the king the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She lifted her chin, her eyes meeting the king's without flinching. "I fear neither imprisonment nor death, Your Majesty," she said. "I fear only the loss of my freedom, the betrayal of my own heart." The king stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he gestured to the guards. "Take her away," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The guards approached Isabel, their hands reaching for her. But before they could touch her, a voice rang out from the back of the hall. "Your Majesty, I beg you to reconsider." It was Gareth. He strode forward, his face pale, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of determination and desperation. He knelt before the king, his head bowed. "This woman is not a traitor," he said, his voice strong and clear. "She is simply misguided. She needs time to understand the wisdom of your decree." The king looked at Gareth, his expression surprised. He had not expected such intervention from his loyal knight. "You defend her, Sir Gareth?" he asked, his voice sharp. "You who brought her here?" Gareth met the king's gaze, his eyes unwavering. "I brought her here because it was my duty," he said. "But I also believe that she deserves a chance. She is a woman of spirit, of courage. She could be a valuable asset to the crown, if given the opportunity." The king was silent for a long moment, considering Gareth's words. He looked at Isabel, then back at Gareth. "Very well," he finally said, his voice grudging. "I will grant her one more chance. She will remain in the castle, under your supervision, Sir Gareth. You will be responsible for her re-education. If she does not come to her senses within 1 moon, she will be sent to the tower." Gareth rose to his feet, his face relieved. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he said. "I will not fail you." Isabel looked at Gareth, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. He had saved her from the tower, for now. But at what cost? He was now her jailer, responsible for breaking her will, for forcing her to accept the king's decree. The price of her defiance, it seemed, was not immediate imprisonment, but a more subtle form of torture, a battle of wills with the very man who had begun to show her a glimmer of understanding. The reprieve was a fragile one, a temporary stay of execution, and she knew the true battle had only just begun. The whispers in the stone halls had grown louder, and she could almost hear the echo of her own fate hanging in the balance. Chapter 7. Scars of the Past. Gareth's supervision was a strange, unsettling blend of freedom and confinement. Isabel was no longer confined to her small chamber, but she was not allowed to leave the castle grounds. She was permitted to wander the gardens, to visit the library, to attend meals in the great hall, but always under Gareth's watchful eye. He was her constant companion, her shadow, a reminder of her precarious position. Their interactions were a complex dance of courtesy and defiance. Isabel maintained a cool, distant demeanor, refusing to show any vulnerability, any sign of weakness. Gareth, in turn, treated her with a formal respect, but his gray eyes often held a hint of something more, a mixture of concern, admiration, and a growing frustration with his impossible task. He attempted to engage her in conversation, to persuade her to accept the king's decree, to see the wisdom of a union with Lord Beaumont. But Isabel met his arguments with a steely resistance, her resolve unwavering. She would not be swayed. She would not be broken. One afternoon, as they walked in the castle gardens, a sprawling expanse of manicured lawns, fragrant flower beds, and ancient trees, Gareth tried a different approach. "Tell me about Westmere," he said, his voice softer than usual, his gaze fixed on a cluster of vibrant red roses. "Tell me about your life before all of this." Isabel hesitated. She was reluctant to share anything personal with him, to reveal any vulnerability. But she also sensed a genuine curiosity in his voice, a desire to understand her, not just to control her. She began to speak, slowly at first, then with growing fluency, describing the beauty of Westmere, the rolling hills, the sparkling rivers, the ancient forests. She spoke of her childhood, of her father's teachings, of her love for writing, hunting, and reading. She spoke of her brother, Thomas, of their close bond, of her grief at their separation. Gareth listened intently, his gray eyes fixed on hers, his expression thoughtful. He asked questions, probing deeper, seeking to understand the woman behind the defiant facade. As Isabel spoke, she felt a sense of release, a shedding of the burden she had been carrying for so long. It was a relief to talk about her home, about her past, about the things she loved. It reminded her of who she was, of what she was fighting for. Gareth, in turn, began to share his own stories. He spoke of his childhood on his family's estate, of his rigorous training as a knight, of the camaraderie he had shared with his fellow soldiers. He spoke of the battles he had fought, of the horrors he had witnessed, of the scars he carried, both visible and invisible. He revealed a vulnerability that surprised Isabel, a depth of feeling that she had not expected. He spoke of his disillusionment with war, of his growing doubts about the king's leadership, of his longing for a life of peace, of purpose. He told her about the loss, again, of his sister, mentioning that she ran for a very similar reason, and that he still carried that pain. As they talked, a bond began to form between them, a connection forged not through force or coercion, but through shared experiences, shared vulnerabilities, shared hopes and fears. Isabel began to see Gareth not just as her captor, but as a man, a complex, flawed, but ultimately honorable man. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the great hall, sharing a quiet meal, Gareth turned to Isabel, his gray eyes searching hers. "Why do you resist so fiercely?" he asked, his voice low, his tone almost pleading. "Why do you cling to this impossible dream of freedom? Why not accept the king's decree, secure your future, and be done with it?" Isabel met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "Because freedom is not an impossible dream, Sir Knight," she said. "It is a fundamental right. It is the essence of who we are. To surrender one's freedom is to surrender one's soul." She paused, then added, her voice softer now, "And because I could never marry a man I do not love. A man who sees me as nothing more than a possession, a means to an end." Gareth looked at her, his expression a mixture of admiration and sadness. "Love," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Is that truly so important?" Isabel nodded. "It is everything," she said. "It is the fire that warms the heart, the light that guides the way, the strength that sustains us through the darkest of times." Gareth was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. He seemed to be lost in thought, wrestling with his own emotions. "I once believed in love," he said softly, his voice tinged with regret. "But I learned that it is a fragile thing, easily broken, easily lost." He looked at Isabel, his gray eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "Do not place your faith in such a fleeting emotion, Lady Isabel," he said. "It will only lead to heartbreak." Isabel felt a pang of sympathy for him. She sensed a deep wound within him, a past love lost, a betrayal that had left him scarred and cynical. "Perhaps," she said, her voice gentle, "but I would rather risk heartbreak than live a life devoid of love, a life of cold duty and empty obligation." Gareth sighed, a weary sound that spoke volumes. "You are a stubborn woman, Lady Isabel," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "And perhaps a foolish one." But even as he said the words, Isabel sensed a shift in him, a subtle softening of his resolve. He was beginning to understand her, to respect her, even if he didn't agree with her choices. The scars of his past, she realized, were not just wounds, but also a source of empathy, a bridge that might, just might, allow them to cross the chasm that separated them. The moon was waning, and the deadline loomed, but in the shared quiet of the hall, a new understanding, fragile but potent, began to take root. He was starting to question. And that was all she needed. Chapter 8. The Tournament of Masks. King Edmund, in a bid to display his power and generosity, and perhaps to further pressure Isabel, announced a grand tournament. Knights from across the kingdom would gather to compete in jousting, sword fighting, and archery, vying for prizes and glory. The event was a spectacle, a display of martial prowess and courtly extravagance, but for Isabel, it was another layer of the gilded cage, a reminder of her captivity and the limited choices before her. Gareth, as a renowned knight, was expected to participate. He seemed ambivalent about the tournament, viewing it as another duty to be fulfilled, another display of loyalty to a king he increasingly questioned. He approached the preparations with his usual efficiency, but Isabel sensed a lack of enthusiasm, a weariness that went beyond the physical demands of the competition. Isabel was expected to attend the tournament, to sit beside Lord Beaumont in the royal box, a visible symbol of the king's intended union. The thought of spending hours in Beaumont's company, enduring his leering gazes and possessive remarks, filled her with dread. She considered feigning illness, but she knew it would only postpone the inevitable and might even arouse the king's suspicion. She decided to use the tournament to her advantage. It was a gathering of the kingdom's most powerful nobles, a potential opportunity to find allies, to sow seeds of dissent, to further her own plans for escape. She would attend, but she would not be a passive observer. She would be a player in this game, using her wits and her charm to navigate the treacherous currents of courtly intrigue. The day of the tournament dawned bright and clear. The castle grounds were transformed into a vibrant spectacle of color and activity. Banners fluttered in the breeze, tents were erected, and crowds of spectators thronged the stands. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and the clang of steel as knights prepared for their contests. Isabel dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep blue velvet, embroidered with silver thread. It was a modest gown, but it accentuated her figure and highlighted her striking features. She wore her hair in a simple braid, adorned with a single silver ribbon. She wanted to look elegant, but not ostentatious, to project an image of strength and dignity, not of submission. Gareth, seeing her for the first time in full courtly attire, was visibly struck by her beauty. He hesitated for a moment, his gray eyes lingering on hers, a flicker of something akin to admiration, perhaps even desire, crossing his features. "You look stunning, Lady Isabel," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. Isabel met his gaze, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "Thank you, Sir Knight," she said. "But I assure you, my appearance is merely a mask, concealing my true intentions." Gareth's expression sobered. "Be careful," he said, his voice low. "This tournament is a stage, and everyone is playing a part. Do not reveal your hand too soon." His words were a warning, but also an acknowledgement of her intelligence, her strategic thinking. He was beginning to see her not just as a defiant bride, but as a formidable opponent, a player in this game of power. As Isabel and Gareth made their way to the royal box, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. She could sense the whispers, the speculation, the judgment. She was the object of curiosity, of envy, of resentment. Lord Beaumont greeted her with a possessive smile, his eyes raking over her in a way that made her skin crawl. He offered her his arm, but Isabel ignored him, taking her seat beside him with a cool formality. The tournament began with a fanfare of trumpets and a parade of knights, each one resplendent in his armor, his horse adorned with colorful trappings. Gareth, riding his magnificent black stallion, was among them, his figure imposing, his skill evident. Isabel watched the jousting with a detached interest, her mind focused on the faces in the crowd, on the subtle interactions between the nobles, on the whispers and glances that betrayed hidden alliances and rivalries. She noticed a group of knights, clustered together, their expressions grim, their conversation hushed. They were known to be critical of the king's policies, of his reliance on Beaumont's counsel. They were potential allies, she realized, men who might be willing to support her cause. During a break in the jousting, Isabel excused herself, ostensibly to seek refreshment. She made her way through the crowd, her movements purposeful, her gaze alert. She approached the group of knights, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. She introduced herself with a courteous smile, engaging them in polite conversation, subtly steering the discussion towards the topic of the king's leadership, of the growing unrest within the kingdom. The knights were cautious at first, reluctant to speak openly. But Isabel's charm, her intelligence, and her evident sincerity gradually won them over. They began to share their concerns, their frustrations, their hopes for a change in leadership. Isabel listened intently, gathering information, assessing their commitment, planting seeds of rebellion. She spoke of the need for justice, for fairness, for a ruler who valued the well-being of his people. She spoke of her own defiance of the king's decree, of her determination to fight for her freedom. The knights were impressed by her courage, her passion, her unwavering resolve. They saw in her a potential leader, a symbol of resistance against the king's tyranny. As the tournament drew to a close, Isabel returned to the royal box, her mind buzzing with possibilities. She had made contact with potential allies. She had planted the seeds of rebellion. She had taken the first steps towards reclaiming her freedom. But she also knew that she had taken a dangerous gamble, that she had exposed herself to even greater risk. The Tournament of Masks had revealed more than just martial prowess. It had unveiled a network of hidden alliances and simmering discontent, a web in which Isabel was now firmly entangled. The stakes were higher than ever, and the game had truly begun. Chapter 9. A Dance of Deception. The days following the tournament were a tense, intricate dance of deception. Isabel maintained the facade of a compliant captive, attending courtly functions, enduring Lord Beaumont's unwanted attentions, and engaging in polite conversation with the king's advisors. But beneath the surface, she was actively working to undermine the king's authority, to strengthen her alliances with the dissenting nobles, and to plot her escape. Gareth was her constant shadow, ever present, ever watchful. But their relationship had shifted subtly. He was no longer simply her jailer, but a reluctant accomplice, a silent observer of her machinations. He provided her with information, warned her of potential dangers, and subtly facilitated her interactions with the rebellious knights. He never explicitly declared his allegiance, but his actions spoke louder than words. He was walking a dangerous tightrope, balancing his sworn duty to the king with his growing sympathy for Isabel's cause, with his own burgeoning doubts about the king's rule. Isabel, in turn, trusted Gareth increasingly, relying on his insights, his judgment, his protection. She knew that he was risking everything for her, that his loyalty to her could cost him his position, his honor, even his life. One evening, as they strolled through the castle gardens, the air heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, Isabel turned to Gareth, her expression serious. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice low, her gaze searching his. "Why are you risking so much for a woman who is, by the king's decree, your enemy?" Gareth hesitated, his gray eyes clouded with a mixture of emotions. He looked away, towards the distant mountains, their peaks shrouded in mist. "I do not know," he said softly, his voice tinged with a weariness that mirrored her own. "Perhaps because I see in you a reflection of my sister. Perhaps because I believe you are right, that the king is unjust, that his rule is harming the kingdom. Perhaps because I am tired of being a tool of tyranny." He turned back to her, his gaze intense. "Perhaps," he added, his voice barely a whisper, "because I have come to care for you, Lady Isabel." His words hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Isabel's heart quickened. She had sensed his growing affection, had felt a similar stirring within herself. But she had suppressed it, had refused to acknowledge it, knowing that it was a dangerous, impossible emotion. She was a captive, he was her captor. She was betrothed to another man, he was sworn to serve the king. Their paths were destined to diverge, their love doomed to remain unfulfilled. "We cannot," she said softly, her voice filled with regret. "It is too dangerous. It is forbidden." Gareth nodded, his expression resigned. "I know," he said, "but I cannot deny what I feel. I cannot pretend that I am unaffected by your courage, your spirit, your beauty." They stood in silence for a long moment, the unspoken emotions swirling between them, a fragile bond forged in the midst of danger and uncertainty. Isabel knew that she had to focus on her escape, on her plans to overthrow the king. She couldn't afford to be distracted by her feelings for Gareth, by the impossible dream of a life together. But she also knew that she couldn't deny the connection between them, the shared understanding, the mutual respect, the growing affection that had blossomed in the heart of their captivity. She continued to meet with the dissenting nobles, often under the guise of religious devotion, attending prayers in the castle chapel, or under the pretense of charitable works, visiting the poor and the sick in the nearby village. Gareth often accompanied her, providing cover, ensuring her safety, facilitating her clandestine meetings. Lord Beaumont grew increasingly suspicious of Isabel's activities, of her frequent absences from the castle, of her growing popularity among the courtiers. He voiced his concerns to the king, warning him of Isabel's potential for rebellion, of her influence over Gareth. The king, already weakened by illness and paranoia, became increasingly wary of Isabel. He ordered his spies to monitor her movements, to report on her every interaction. The pressure mounted, the danger increased, the stakes grew ever higher. Isabel knew that she was walking a tightrope, that one wrong step could lead to her downfall, to the failure of her plans, to the imprisonment or death of those who had placed their trust in her. But she wouldn't falter. She wouldn't surrender. She would continue to dance the dance of deception, to play the game of power, to fight for her freedom, for the future of the kingdom, and for the faint, fragile hope of a love that defied all odds. The deception was a heavy cloak, but beneath it, a plan was taking shape, a plan that relied on trust, timing, and the courage of those who dared to dream of a different future. And she would see it through. Chapter 10. The Serpent's Kiss. Lord Beaumont, his patience wearing thin and his ambition fueled by the king's growing paranoia, decided to take matters into his own hands. He saw Isabel as a threat, an obstacle to his plans for power, and he was determined to eliminate her, one way or another. He arranged a private meeting with Isabel, ostensibly to discuss the details of their impending marriage, a marriage that seemed increasingly unlikely, given Isabel's continued defiance and the king's waning health. Isabel, wary of Beaumont's intentions, but unable to refuse his summons without arousing further suspicion, agreed to meet him in the castle library, a secluded, dimly lit chamber filled with ancient tomes and forgotten scrolls. Gareth, sensing danger, insisted on accompanying her, positioning himself discreetly near the entrance, ready to intervene if necessary. His presence was a reassurance, a silent promise of protection, but Isabel knew that even his strength might not be enough to counter Beaumont's treachery. Beaumont greeted Isabel with a forced smile, his eyes cold and calculating. He gestured towards a table laden with wine and delicacies, a pretense of hospitality that failed to mask his underlying hostility. "Lady Isabel," he said, his voice smooth and venomous, "I have been patient with you. I have indulged your whims. But my patience has reached its limit. The king is growing impatient. He demands that our union be finalized." Isabel met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "I have made my position clear, Lord Beaumont," she said. "I will not marry you. I would rather face death than a life of servitude to a man I despise." Beaumont's smile vanished. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You misunderstand, my dear," he said. "You have no choice in the matter. The king has decreed it, and I will not be denied." He reached for a goblet of wine, offering it to Isabel. "Drink," he said. "A toast to our future." Isabel's instinct screamed at her. She sensed a trap, a subtle danger lurking beneath Beaumont's forced civility. She remembered the whispers she had overheard, the rumors of poisonings, of sudden deaths within the castle walls. She hesitated, her gaze flickering towards Gareth, who stood silently in the shadows, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Beaumont noticed her hesitation. "What is it, my lady?" he asked, his voice laced with a mocking tone. "Are you afraid? Do you doubt my hospitality?" Isabel forced a smile, masking her fear with a facade of composure. "Of course not, Lord Beaumont," she said. "I am simply not thirsty." She reached for a piece of fruit from the table, a small, seemingly harmless apple. She took a bite, chewing slowly, her eyes fixed on Beaumont's. Beaumont watched her, his expression a mixture of frustration and suspicion. He had expected her to refuse the wine, to confirm his suspicions, to give him an excuse to act. But her unexpected compliance threw him off balance. He took a sip of his own wine, a gesture of reassurance, but his eyes never left Isabel's. Suddenly, Isabel gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Her eyes widened in pain, her face contorted in agony. She stumbled, clutching at the table for support. "Poison!" she gasped, her voice hoarse, her eyes filled with terror. "He poisoned me," she collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Gareth rushed forward, his sword drawn, his face a mask of fury. He knelt beside Isabel, cradling her in his arms, his eyes searching for any sign of life. Beaumont stood frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had not poisoned the wine. He had intended to use the threat of poison, to force Isabel into submission, to make her confess her treasonous plots. But he had not actually intended to harm her. At least, not yet. "I didn't," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I swear I didn't poison her." Gareth ignored him. He lifted Isabel in his arms, her body limp and lifeless. He carried her out of the library, his heart pounding with a mixture of grief and rage. He knew that Isabel had been playing a part, that she had faked her own poisoning to expose Beaumont's treachery, to turn the tables on her enemy. But he also knew that it was a dangerous gamble, that she had risked her own life to achieve her goals. As he carried her through the castle corridors, he could hear the whispers, the rumors spreading like wildfire. Lady Isabel had been poisoned by Lord Beaumont. The king's betrothed was dead. The kingdom was in turmoil. Gareth knew that he had to act quickly, to protect Isabel, to expose Beaumont's lies, to prevent the kingdom from descending into chaos. He had to find a safe place for her, a place where she could recover, where she could continue her fight for freedom. The Serpent's Kiss, a desperate act of deception, had set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of their lives and the fate of the kingdom forever. The game had taken a deadly turn, and the players were scattered, their alliances shattered, their futures uncertain. He had to get her out of the castle. Now. Chapter 11. Echoes of Lost Love. Gareth carried Isabel, seemingly lifeless, not to the castle healers, but away, towards the stables. He knew that the castle was no longer safe, that Beaumont's influence and the king's paranoia made it a viper's nest. He needed to get Isabel away, to a place where she could recover, where she could plan her next move, where she would be safe from the immediate threat. He saddled his warhorse, Shadow, with practiced efficiency, his movements swift and silent. He secured Isabel's seemingly lifeless body in front of him, holding her close, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. He whispered soothing words to her. Even though he knew she couldn't hear him, his voice choked with emotion. He rode out of the castle under the cover of darkness, using a little-known postern gate, avoiding the main thoroughfares, his senses alert to any sign of pursuit. He headed towards the dense forest that bordered the castle grounds, a place he knew well, a place that offered concealment and a measure of safety. Once deep within the forest, he dismounted, gently laying Isabel on a bed of soft moss beneath a towering oak tree. He checked her pulse, her breathing, relieved to find that she was still alive, her performance having been tragically convincing. He waited, his hand resting on her forehead, his eyes searching her face for any sign of consciousness. The forest was silent, save for the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, cast long, dancing shadows across the forest floor. Finally, Isabel stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. She looked at Gareth, her eyes dazed, her expression confused. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice weak. "Safe," Gareth said, his voice filled with relief. "You are safe, my lady. We are away from the castle, away from Beaumont." Isabel's memory returned, flooding her with the events of the past few hours. She remembered the library, the wine, the feigned poisoning, the desperate gamble she had taken. "Did it work?" she asked, her voice still hoarse. "Did they believe me?" Gareth nodded. "They believed you," he said. The castle is in chaos. Beaumont is under suspicion. The king is enraged. Isabel struggled to sit up, her body aching, her head throbbing. Gareth helped her, supporting her with his arm. "We need to leave," she said, her voice stronger now. "We need to find a safe haven, a place where we can plan our next move." Gareth agreed. He knew of a small, isolated monastery hidden deep within the mountains, a place where they might find refuge, where they could regroup and strategize. It was a dangerous journey, but it was their best hope. As they prepared to leave, Isabel noticed a small, silver locket around Gareth's neck, partially hidden beneath his tunic. It was a familiar locket, one she had seen before, in a miniature portrait, long ago. "That locket," she said, her voice hesitant. "Where did you get it?" Gareth looked at her, surprised. He touched the locket, his fingers tracing its intricate design. "It was my sister's," he said softly, his voice filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "She gave it to me before she disappeared." Isabel's heart skipped a beat. She remembered the story Gareth had told her, of his sister who had fled an arranged marriage, who had never been found. She remembered the miniature portrait in the locket she carried, the portrait of her father. She reached into her own pouch, pulling out her own locket, the one containing the portrait of her father. She opened it, revealing the miniature image of a strong, handsome man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Gareth stared at the portrait, his eyes widening in disbelief. That is my father," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That is Lord Alaric." Isabel looked at Gareth, her mind reeling. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The locket, the story, the resemblance. "Your sister, was she named Alara?" Isabel asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gareth nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Yes," he said. "Her name was Alara. She was betrothed to a cruel lord, a man she despised. She fled, rather than marry him." Isabel's heart ached with a mixture of grief and joy. She had found her lost family, her father's best friend's son, a man who had become her captor, her protector, her love. "My father," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "was Lord Alaric's closest friend. They fought together, they lived together, they were like brothers." She paused. "He named me his heir because he never stopped looking for Alara." Gareth took Isabel's hand, his grip firm, his eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and sorrow. "We are family," he said, his voice trembling. "We are connected, not just by fate, but by blood." The echoes of lost love, of a sister's flight, of a father's grief, had brought them together, revealing a truth that had been hidden for years. The monastery, their destination, was not just a refuge, but a place of healing, a place where they could forge a new bond, a new family, a new future. The forest, once a place of escape, had become a place of revelation, a place where the past and the present collided, creating a future that was both uncertain and filled with a fragile, bittersweet hope. This changes everything. Chapter 12. The Unveiling of Truth. The journey to the monastery was arduous, a trek through rugged mountains and treacherous passes. But the revelation of their shared past, of their familial connection, gave Isabel and Gareth a newfound strength, a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer simply captor and captive, allies in a dangerous game, but family, bound by blood and a shared history. They spoke of Alara, of Isabel's father, of the events that had separated their families, of the grief and loss that had haunted them both. They pieced together the fragments of their past, creating a tapestry of shared memories, of a love that had endured despite distance and time. Gareth told Isabel more about Alara, of her spirited nature, of her love for riding and hunting, of her determination to choose her own destiny. He spoke of his father's grief, of his relentless search for his lost daughter, of his unwavering belief that she was still alive. Isabel, in turn, shared her memories of her father, of his stories about Alara, of his unwavering loyalty to his friend, of his hope that one day their families would be reunited. She spoke of her own determination to honor her father's memory, to live up to his ideals of freedom and justice. As they journeyed, the landscape reflected their inner turmoil, their shared grief, their burgeoning hope. The towering mountains, their peaks shrouded in mist, mirrored the obstacles they faced, the uncertainties that lay ahead. The rushing rivers, their waters clear and cold, symbolized the cleansing power of truth, the washing away of past sorrows. Finally, after days of travel, they reached the monastery, a small, secluded haven nestled high in the mountains. It was a place of peace, of contemplation, of spiritual refuge. The monks, clad in simple brown robes, welcomed them with quiet courtesy, offering them shelter, food, and a place to rest. The monastery was a world away from the intrigues and dangers of the king's court. The silence was profound, broken only by the chanting of the monks, the rustling of leaves, the gentle murmur of a nearby stream. The air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and wildflowers. Isabel and Gareth spent their days in quiet contemplation, exploring the monastery grounds, talking with the monks, seeking solace in the peaceful surroundings. They shared their story with the abbot, a wise, compassionate man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The abbot listened intently, his gaze filled with understanding. He offered them his counsel, his guidance, his support. He spoke of the importance of forgiveness, of healing, of finding peace within oneself. He also revealed a startling truth. He had known Alara. She had sought refuge in the monastery years ago, after fleeing her arranged marriage. She had lived among them for a time, finding solace in their community, in their devotion to God. But she had not stayed. She had felt a calling, a need to help others, to use her skills and her knowledge to make a difference in the world. She had left the monastery, venturing out into the unknown, determined to forge her own path. The abbot had kept her secret, honoring her wishes, protecting her from those who would seek to harm her. He had prayed for her safety, for her well-being, for her eventual return. Isabel and Gareth were stunned by this revelation. Alara was alive. She had not perished, as they had feared. She had found a new life, a new purpose, a new way to live her truth. The knowledge filled them with a renewed sense of hope, a determination to find her, to reunite their family, to bring closure to their shared past. The abbot gave them a clue, a small, intricately carved wooden cross that Alara had left behind. It was a symbol of her faith, of her courage, of her unwavering spirit. "Follow this sign," the abbot said, his voice filled with a gentle wisdom. "It will lead you to her. It will guide you on your path." Isabel and Gareth left the monastery, their hearts filled with a mixture of gratitude, hope, and determination. They had found refuge. They had found truth. They had found a new purpose. They had found each other. They were no longer simply fugitives, seeking to escape the king's wrath. They were family, on a quest to reunite with their lost loved one, to heal the wounds of the past, to forge a new future. The unveiling of truth had transformed them, had given them a strength they had not known they possessed. They were ready to face the challenges ahead, to fight for their freedom, for their family, for their love. The mountains, once a barrier, now seemed to beckon them forward, a path leading to a destiny they could not yet fully comprehend, but were determined to embrace. The wooden cross, a small, fragile symbol, became a beacon of hope, guiding them towards a reunion that had been years in the making. The king, Beaumont. All of it felt secondary. Chapter 13. Flames of Rebellion. The revelation at the monastery had shifted their priorities. While escaping the king's immediate reach remained crucial, the quest to find Alara, to reunite their long-separated family, became the driving force. The wooden cross, a tangible link to Alara, became their guide, a symbol of hope amidst the uncertainty. They decided to return, cautiously, to the edges of Westmere. It was a risk, placing them closer to the king's forces, but it was also the region Alara had known best, the place where clues to her whereabouts might be most likely found. Gareth's knowledge of the land, combined with Isabel's memories of her father's stories, guided their path. They avoided the main roads, traveling through hidden valleys and dense forests, relying on the kindness of shepherds and villagers who remembered Lord Alaric and his unwavering loyalty to his people. These were people who distrusted King Edmund and resented Lord Beaumont's growing influence. They offered Gareth and Isabel food, shelter, and whispered information. The news from the king's court was grim. Beaumont, though initially suspected of Isabel's poisoning, had managed to shift the blame, using his influence and the king's weakened state to paint Isabel as a traitorous sorceress who had attempted to kill him and seize Westmere for herself. The king, increasingly erratic and paranoid, had issued a decree for Isabel's capture and execution, placing a substantial bounty on her head. Gareth's own position was precarious. He was officially considered a deserter, a traitor who had aided and abetted Isabel's escape. His lands and titles were forfeit, his name disgraced. Yet, he showed no regret, his commitment to Isabel and their shared quest unwavering. As they traveled, they began to encounter others who were disillusioned with the king's rule. Knights who had served with Gareth, men-at-arms who remembered Lord Alaric's justice, villagers burdened by excessive taxes and Beaumont's cruelty. A network of dissent began to coalesce around them, a nascent rebellion fueled by shared grievances and a longing for a better future. One evening, gathered around a crackling fire in a hidden cave, a grizzled old knight, Sir Kevern, who had once served under both Lord Alaric and Gareth's father, spoke. "The king is weak," he said, his voice raspy with age and anger. "Beaumont pulls the strings, poisoning his mind, turning him against his own people. We cannot stand idly by while our kingdom is destroyed." Others echoed his sentiment, their voices filled with a mixture of frustration and determination. They looked to Gareth, to Isabel, as potential leaders, as symbols of resistance against the king's tyranny. Isabel, initially hesitant to embrace the role of a rebel leader, felt a growing sense of responsibility. She remembered her father's teachings, his belief in justice, his commitment to his people. She saw the desperation in the eyes of those who had placed their trust in her. "We cannot overthrow the king alone," she said, her voice firm. "We need allies. We need a plan. We need to unite those who oppose his rule." Gareth agreed. "We need to find Alara," he added. "She may have connections, resources, knowledge that could help us." The wooden cross became a symbol not just of their personal quest, but of their growing rebellion. They showed it to those they trusted, asking for information, seeking clues to Alara's whereabouts. One day, a young shepherd boy, recognizing the cross from a story his grandmother had told him, led them to a hidden valley, a place where a woman known only as the healer lived. She was said to possess extraordinary skills in medicine, to have a deep knowledge of herbs and remedies, to offer aid to those in need. As they approached the valley, Isabel felt a sense of anticipation, a premonition that they were close to their goal. The air was filled with the scent of wildflowers and herbs, the sound of birdsong, and a rushing stream. They found the healer's dwelling, a small, simple cottage nestled amidst a vibrant garden of medicinal plants. A woman emerged, her face weathered by the sun and wind, her eyes kind and wise, her hair streaked with gray. Isabel and Gareth looked at her, their hearts pounding with hope. They showed her the wooden cross, their eyes searching hers for any sign of recognition. The woman's gaze softened. She took the cross in her hand, her fingers tracing its intricate carvings. "Alara," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. This was hers. Isabel and Gareth exchanged a look of joy and relief. They had found her. Their quest was nearing its end. The flames of rebellion, once a distant flicker, now burned bright, fueled by the hope of reunion, by the promise of justice, and by the courage of those who dared to challenge a tyrant's rule. The healer was not Alara, but she knew her, and that was enough. For now. Chapter 14. The Weight of a Broken Oath. The healer, whose name was Mara, confirmed that she knew Alara. They had been close friends, sharing a bond forged through their shared knowledge of healing and their commitment to helping those in need. Mara hadn't seen Alara in several months, but she knew where Alara had been headed, to the coastal city of Oakhaven, a bustling port known for its trade and its diverse population, but also for its undercurrent of unrest and its distance from the king's direct control. Mara provided Gareth and Isabel with supplies, fresh horses, and a detailed map of the safest route to Oakhaven. She also gave them a message for Alara, a small, sealed scroll containing words of encouragement and a coded warning about the growing rebellion and the king's decree. The journey to Oakhaven was fraught with danger. They had to avoid the king's patrols, navigate treacherous terrain, and rely on the kindness of strangers, many of whom were wary of outsiders and fearful of the king's wrath. Gareth's military skills proved invaluable, his ability to anticipate danger, to find hidden paths, to defend them against attack. But he was also haunted by the weight of his broken oath, by the knowledge that he was now considered a traitor, a rebel against the crown he had once sworn to serve. One evening, as they camped beneath a star-studded sky, Isabel found Gareth staring into the flames of their campfire, his expression troubled, his gray eyes filled with a deep sadness. "What troubles you, Sir Knight?" she asked softly, her voice filled with concern. Gareth sighed, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I have betrayed my oath," he said, his voice low and heavy. "I have broken my vow to the king. I am a dishonorable man." Isabel reached out, placing her hand on his arm. "You have done no such thing," she said firmly. "You have chosen to follow your conscience, to uphold justice, to protect those who are innocent. That is not dishonorable. That is courageous." Gareth looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "But my oath," he began. "Your oath was to a flawed king," Isabel interrupted, her voice passionate. "A king who has become a tyrant, who has betrayed his own people. You are not bound to follow unjust orders. You are not bound to serve a ruler who has lost his way." She paused, then added, her voice softer now, "You are bound to something greater, Gareth. To your conscience, to your sense of justice, to your family." Gareth's gaze softened. He took Isabel's hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Your words, they give me strength." They sat in silence for a long moment, the unspoken emotions swirling between them, a bond forged through shared adversity, shared purpose, and a growing love that defied all obstacles. As they continued their journey, they encountered further evidence of the king's cruelty and the growing unrest within the kingdom. Villages were impoverished, their people starving, their resources drained by the king's endless wars and Beaumont's insatiable greed. They also encountered more people who were willing to join their cause, knights who had deserted the king's army, men-at-arms who had grown disillusioned with their service, villagers who were desperate for change. A small but growing army began to form around them, a force united by their opposition to the king and their loyalty to Isabel and Gareth. The weight of a broken oath, once a burden on Gareth's soul, began to transform into a symbol of defiance, a testament to his courage, a rallying cry for those who sought to overthrow the king's tyranny. He was no longer simply a knight who had betrayed his vow, but a leader, a champion of justice, a beacon of hope for a kingdom in desperate need of change. The journey to Oakhaven was not just a quest to find Alara, but a pilgrimage towards a reckoning, a confrontation with the forces of tyranny, a battle for the future of the kingdom. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but Gareth no longer bore it alone. He had Isabel, he had his newfound family, and he had a growing army of loyal followers who believed in his cause. The broken oath had become a badge of honor, a symbol of his unwavering commitment to justice, and a testament to the transformative power of love and loyalty. They were approaching Oakhaven, and the storm was gathering. Chapter 15. A Haven in the Storm. Oakhaven was a city of stark contrasts. Grand merchant houses and bustling marketplaces stood alongside squalid slums and hidden alleyways. The air was thick with the scent of salt, spices, and the ever-present odor of poverty and desperation. It was a place of opportunity and danger, of wealth and misery, of freedom and oppression. Gareth and Isabel, disguised as simple travelers, entered the city cautiously, their senses alert to any sign of the king's forces or Beaumont spies. They knew that Oakhaven, while distant from the king's direct control, was still a dangerous place, a city where allegiances shifted like the tides and where betrayal lurked around every corner. Following Mara's instructions, they sought out a small, unassuming tavern near the docks, the Salty Siren, a place known for its discreet clientele and its tolerance for whispered secrets. It was a haven for smugglers, dissidents, and those who sought to avoid the watchful eyes of the authorities. The tavern keeper, a stout woman with a weathered face and a sharp tongue, recognized the coded phrase Mara had given them. She led them to a private room, a dimly lit chamber at the back of the tavern, where they could speak freely. "Mara sent word you were coming," she said, her voice low and gruff. "She said you were looking for the healer's friend." Isabel and Gareth exchanged a look of hope. They were close. "Alara," Isabel said, her voice filled with anticipation. "We seek Alara. She is family." The tavern keeper studied them for a moment, her eyes assessing their sincerity, their trustworthiness. Then she nodded. "Alara is known here," she said. "She works among the poor, the sick, the forgotten. She is a healer like Mara, but she also organizes. She helps those who are oppressed, who are exploited, who are seeking a better life." The tavern keeper gave them directions to a small, hidden clinic in the heart of the slums, a place where Alara tended to the sick and the injured, where she offered solace and support to those in need. As they made their way through the narrow, crowded streets, Isabel and Gareth witnessed firsthand the poverty and desperation that plagued Oakhaven. They saw emaciated children begging for food, sick and injured people lying on the streets, and the ever-present threat of violence and exploitation. They found the clinic, a small, unassuming building tucked away in a narrow alleyway. It was a humble place, but it was clean and well-organized, a testament to Alara's dedication and compassion. They entered cautiously, their hearts pounding with anticipation. A young woman, her face pale but determined, greeted them. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice wary. Isabel stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the young woman's. "We seek Alara," she said. "We are family." The young woman's eyes widened in surprise. She studied them for a moment, then nodded. "Follow me," she said. She led them to a small, private room at the back of the clinic. A woman sat at a table, tending to a wounded man. Her back was to them, but Isabel recognized the familiar curve of her shoulders, the way she held her head, the way her hands moved with a practiced grace. "Alara?" Isabel whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The woman turned, and Isabel's heart leaped with joy. It was her. Alara. Older, weathered by time and hardship, but undeniably her. Her eyes, the same striking gray as Gareth's, widened in disbelief. "Isabel?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Gareth?" The years melted away as they embraced, tears streaming down their faces, a reunion long overdue, a family restored. The haven in the storm, a small, humble clinic in the heart of a troubled city, had become the setting for a moment of profound joy, a testament to the enduring power of love and family. The storm outside still raged, the challenges remained, but for now, in this quiet sanctuary, they were together, and that was all that mattered. A new chapter had begun. Chapter 16. The Edge of the Abyss. The reunion with Alara was bittersweet. Joy mingled with the grim reality of their situation. Alara, while overjoyed to see Isabel and Gareth, was also deeply concerned about the growing rebellion, the king's increasing tyranny, and the danger they all faced. She had established a network of support in Oakhaven, a clandestine organization of merchants, artisans, and former soldiers who were disillusioned with the king's rule and sympathetic to the plight of the poor and oppressed. They provided Alara with resources, information, and protection, allowing her to continue her work among the city's most vulnerable populations. Alara's network was a valuable asset, but it was also fragile. Oakhaven was a city of spies and informants, and Beaumont had agents everywhere, seeking to root out dissent and crush any opposition to the king's authority. Isabel and Gareth shared their story with Alara, recounting their escape from the king's court, their discovery of their shared past, their growing rebellion, and their quest to find her. Alara listened intently, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride, concern, and a fierce determination to help them. "We need to act quickly," Alara said, her voice firm. "Beaumont's influence is growing, and the king is becoming more erratic, more dangerous. We need to unite the various factions that oppose his rule, to create a force strong enough to challenge his authority." She proposed a plan: to use Oakhaven as a base of operations, to gather their forces, to coordinate their efforts, and to launch a coordinated rebellion against the king. It was a risky plan, fraught with danger, but it was their best hope for success. Gareth, with his military experience, began to organize the disparate groups of rebels, training them, equipping them, and preparing them for battle. Isabel, with her charisma and her unwavering commitment to justice, rallied support among the city's population, inspiring them to join their cause, to fight for their freedom. Alara, with her network of contacts and her deep understanding of the city's undercurrents, provided intelligence, resources, and logistical support. She also continued her work among the poor and the sick, providing them with medical care and offering them hope in a time of despair. As their preparations progressed, they faced numerous challenges. Beaumont's spies were everywhere, seeking to infiltrate their ranks, to sabotage their efforts, to sow discord among their followers. They had to be constantly vigilant, constantly wary of betrayal. One evening, a coded message arrived from Mara, warning them that Beaumont was planning a major offensive against Oakhaven, intending to crush the rebellion before it could gain further momentum. He had amassed a large force of soldiers, mercenaries, and loyalists, and he was marching towards the city, determined to make an example of those who dared to defy the king. Isabel, Gareth, and Alara knew that they were facing a critical moment. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a far more experienced and well-equipped enemy. They were standing on the edge of the abyss, their future and the future of the kingdom, hanging in the balance. They gathered their forces, a ragtag army of knights, men-at-arms, villagers, and city dwellers, united by their shared grievances and their determination to fight for their freedom. They prepared their defenses, barricading the city gates, fortifying the walls, and preparing for a siege. Gareth, standing on the city walls, looked out at the approaching enemy, his heart heavy with the weight of responsibility. He knew that many of his followers would likely die in the coming battle, that their chances of success were slim. Isabel, standing beside him, placed her hand on his arm. "We fight for what is right," she said, her voice firm. "We fight for our freedom, for our family, for our future. We may not win, but we will not surrender." Alara, joining them on the walls, added her voice to theirs. "We fight for those who cannot fight for themselves," she said. "For the poor, the sick, the oppressed. We fight for a better world, a world free from tyranny and injustice." As the enemy approached, the air filled with the sounds of war drums, the clang of steel, and the shouts of soldiers. The battle for Oakhaven, the battle for the future of the kingdom, was about to begin. The edge of the abyss loomed before them, a chasm of uncertainty and danger, but they faced it together, united by their love, their loyalty, and their unwavering commitment to justice. They were ready. Chapter 17. Blood and Betrayal. The battle for Oakhaven was fierce and brutal. Beaumont's forces, superior in numbers and equipment, attacked the city with relentless fury. They battered the walls with siege engines, scaled the ramparts with ladders, and engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the defenders. Gareth, leading the defense, fought with the courage and skill of a seasoned warrior. He rallied his troops, inspired them to fight on, and repelled wave after wave of attackers. But he was also keenly aware of their precarious position, of the overwhelming odds they faced. Isabel, though not a trained warrior, fought alongside the defenders, providing support, tending to the wounded, and inspiring them with her unwavering courage. She moved through the chaos of battle with a calm determination, her presence a beacon of hope amidst the carnage. Alara, working tirelessly in the makeshift clinic, tended to the injured, both soldiers and civilians. She used her knowledge of healing to save lives, to ease suffering, and to offer comfort to those who were facing death. The battle raged for hours, the outcome uncertain. The defenders, though outnumbered, fought with a fierce determination, fueled by their desperation and their belief in their cause. They repelled several assaults, inflicting heavy casualties on Beaumont's forces. But Beaumont's army was relentless. They continued to press their attack, gradually wearing down the defenders, pushing them back towards the city center. As the battle reached its climax, a shocking betrayal occurred. A group of city guards, bribed by Beaumont's agents, opened a side gate, allowing a contingent of enemy soldiers to infiltrate the city. The defenders were caught off guard, their lines broken, their defenses compromised. Gareth, realizing the danger, rallied a small group of loyal knights and rushed to close the breach. They fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and overwhelmed. In the midst of the melee, Gareth was struck by a sword, a blow that pierced his armor and wounded him deeply. He fell to the ground, his vision blurring, his strength ebbing away. Isabel, seeing Gareth fall, screamed his name and rushed to his side. She knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap, her tears streaming down her face. "Gareth," she cried. "Hold on. You must hold on." Gareth looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "Isabel," he whispered, his voice weak. "I failed." "No," Isabel said fiercely. "You did not fail. You fought bravely. You are my hero." Alara, arriving at the scene, assessed Gareth's wound. It was serious, life-threatening. She worked quickly, using her skills to stem the bleeding, to stabilize his condition. But she knew that he needed more help than she could provide in the midst of battle. The betrayal had turned the tide of the battle. Beaumont's forces were pouring into the city, overwhelming the remaining defenders. The situation was desperate, the hope of victory fading fast. Isabel, seeing the inevitable defeat, made a difficult decision. She ordered a retreat, a withdrawal from the city, a desperate attempt to save the lives of those who remained. With Alara's help, she managed to get Gareth to safety, carrying him through the chaos of the retreating forces, seeking refuge in the hidden alleyways and secret passages of the city. The battle for Oakhaven was lost. Beaumont's forces had triumphed, their victory secured through treachery and overwhelming force. But the rebellion was not over. The spirit of resistance, though battered and bruised, still flickered, fueled by the courage of those who had survived, by the memory of those who had fallen, and by the unwavering determination of Isabel, Alara, and the wounded Gareth to continue the fight. The betrayal had been a devastating blow, but it had also steeled their resolve, hardening their hearts against the enemy, and strengthening their commitment to the cause of freedom. They were running, but it wasn't over. Chapter 18. The Lioness's Roar. The retreat from Oakhaven was chaotic and heartbreaking. Isabel, Alara, and a small band of loyal followers, carrying the wounded Gareth, fled through the city's underbelly, pursued by Beaumont's victorious troops. They navigated a labyrinth of narrow alleyways, hidden tunnels, and secret passages, relying on Alara's knowledge of the city and the assistance of sympathetic citizens who risked their lives to help them. They finally found temporary refuge in a hidden cellar beneath a ruined building, a place known only to a handful of Alara's most trusted contacts. It was a dark, damp, and cramped space, but it offered a measure of safety, a place to rest, to tend to Gareth's wounds, and to plan their next move. Gareth's condition was precarious. Alara had managed to stabilize him, but his wound was severe, and he had lost a significant amount of blood. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever rising, his strength ebbing away. Isabel sat beside him, holding his hand, her heart heavy with grief and fear. She blamed herself for the defeat at Oakhaven, for Gareth's injuries, for the suffering of those who had placed their trust in her. Alara, seeing Isabel's despair, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did everything you could," she said softly. "You fought bravely. You inspired others to fight for their freedom. You cannot blame yourself for Beaumont's treachery." Isabel looked at Alara, her eyes filled with tears. "But Gareth," she whispered, "I cannot lose him. I love him." Alara nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know," she said. And he loves you. He would not want you to give up hope. He would want you to continue the fight. Isabel took a deep breath, steeling her resolve. Alara was right. She couldn't give up. She had to be strong, for Gareth, for Alara, for the cause they had all fought for. She spent the next few days tending to Gareth, nursing him with Alara's help, praying for his recovery. She also began to plan their next move, to devise a strategy to continue the rebellion, to strike back at Beaumont and the king. She knew that they were facing overwhelming odds, that their chances of success were slim. But she also knew that they couldn't surrender. They had to fight on for the sake of those who had died, for the sake of those who still lived under the king's tyranny, for the sake of a future free from oppression. As Gareth slowly began to recover, Isabel shared her plans with him, seeking his counsel, his guidance. Despite his weakness, Gareth's mind was still sharp, his strategic thinking invaluable. He suggested that they seek support from the northern lords, the traditional allies of Westmere, those who had remained loyal to Isabel's father and who were likely to be sympathetic to their cause. It was a risky proposition, requiring a long and dangerous journey, but it was their best hope for gaining the strength they needed to challenge the king. Isabel agreed. She knew that she had to take bold action, to rally support, to reignite the flames of rebellion. With Gareth slowly regaining his strength, and with a small but loyal band of followers, Isabel and Alara prepared to leave Oakhaven, to embark on a new journey, a new quest for allies, a new fight for freedom. As they prepared to depart, Isabel stood before her followers, her voice strong and clear, her eyes blazing with determination. "We have suffered a defeat," she said. "But we are not defeated. We have lost a battle, but we have not lost the war. We will rise again. We will fight on. We will not rest until we have overthrown the tyrant king and brought justice to our kingdom." Her words were a roar, a lioness's roar, echoing through the hidden cellar, inspiring her followers, igniting their courage, and reaffirming their commitment to the cause. The retreat from Oakhaven had been a setback, but it had also forged a new leader, a woman who had risen from the ashes of defeat, stronger, more determined, and more dangerous than ever before. The king and Beaumont had made a grave mistake. They should have killed her when they had the chance. Chapter 19. A Kingdom Divided. The journey north was arduous and perilous. Isabel, Alara, and the recovering Gareth, accompanied by their small band of loyal followers, traveled in secret, avoiding the main roads, relying on the kindness of strangers and the guidance of those who sympathized with their cause. They faced constant threats, the king's patrols, Beaumont spies, and the harsh realities of the unforgiving landscape. News of the fall of Oakhaven had spread throughout the kingdom, fueling both fear and defiance. While some cowered in submission, others were emboldened by Isabel's resistance, seeing in her a symbol of hope, a leader who dared to challenge the king's tyranny. As they traveled, they encountered pockets of resistance, small groups of rebels who had been operating independently, fighting their own battles against the king's forces. Isabel, with her charisma and her unwavering commitment to justice, began to unite these disparate groups, forging alliances and building a larger, more cohesive force. Gareth, though still recovering from his wounds, provided invaluable military counsel, advising Isabel on strategy, tactics, and the logistics of organizing a rebellion. His experience and his reputation as a skilled warrior inspired confidence in their followers, bolstering their morale and their fighting spirit. Alara, with her knowledge of healing and her network of contacts, provided essential support, tending to the wounded, gathering intelligence, and securing supplies. Her compassion and her unwavering commitment to helping others earned her the respect and loyalty of those around them. Their journey led them to the borders of Westmere, Isabel's ancestral home, a place now firmly under Beaumont's control. The sight of her former home, now occupied by her enemy, fueled Isabel's determination, strengthening her resolve to reclaim what was rightfully hers and to bring Beaumont to justice. They sought an audience with Lord Thomas, Isabel's brother, the current Lord of Westmere. Thomas had initially urged Isabel to accept the king's decree, to marry Beaumont and secure Westmere's future. But he had also shown a deep-seated fear of the king's wrath, a reluctance to openly defy his authority. The meeting with Thomas was tense and emotional. Isabel pleaded with him to join their cause, to fight for their family, for their people, for their freedom. She reminded him of their father's teachings, of his commitment to justice, of his unwavering loyalty to his friends and his people. Thomas was torn. He loved his sister, he respected Gareth, and he despised Beaumont. But he was also afraid, fearful of the consequences of rebellion, of the potential loss of Westmere, of his own life. Gareth, understanding Thomas's dilemma, spoke to him, not as a rebel leader, but as a kinsman, as a friend, as a man who had once sworn an oath to the king, but who had chosen to follow his conscience instead. "There is a greater oath," Gareth said, his voice firm but compassionate. "An oath to justice, to honor, to the well-being of our people. That oath supersedes any vow made to a tyrant." Alara, adding her voice to theirs, spoke of the suffering of the people under the king's rule, of the injustice and the oppression that had become commonplace. She reminded Thomas of his duty as a lord, of his responsibility to protect those who depended on him. Finally, after a long and agonizing deliberation, Thomas made his decision. He would join their cause. He would pledge the support of Westmere to the rebellion. He would fight alongside his sister, his kinsman, and the woman he had come to respect and admire. The alliance with Westmere was a turning point. It provided the rebellion with a significant boost in resources, manpower, and legitimacy. It also sent a clear message to the rest of the kingdom. Westmere, a powerful and strategically important holding, had defied the king. The kingdom was now truly divided. The lines were drawn. The battle for the throne, for the future of the realm, was about to enter its final, decisive phase. The journey north had been long and arduous, but it had forged a powerful alliance, a force capable of challenging the king's authority and bringing an end to his tyrannical rule. The lioness had found her allies, and her roar was about to shake the foundations of the kingdom. And the king was about to face a force he never imagined. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. With Westmere's support secured, the rebellion gained momentum. Lords who had previously hesitated, fearing the king's wrath, now openly declared their allegiance to Isabel, bringing their troops, resources, and influence to her cause. The tide was turning. The final confrontation was inevitable. King Edmund, enraged by Isabel's defiance and the growing rebellion, amassed his forces, determined to crush the uprising and make an example of those who dared to challenge his authority. He marched towards Westmere, the heart of the rebellion, intending to lay siege to the castle and bring Isabel to her knees. Isabel, Gareth, Alara, and Thomas, along with their combined forces, prepared for the final battle. They fortified Westmere's defenses, trained their troops, and devised a strategy to counter the king's superior numbers and firepower. The atmosphere within Westmere was tense, a mixture of fear and determination. The defenders knew that they were facing a formidable enemy, that the odds were stacked against them. But they also knew that they were fighting for their freedom, for their families, for their future. Isabel, standing on the castle walls, looked out at the approaching enemy army, a vast sea of soldiers stretching as far as the eye could see. She felt the weight of responsibility, the burden of leadership, but she also felt a surge of determination, a fierce resolve to fight for what was right. Gareth, fully recovered from his wounds, stood beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He had shed the last vestiges of his doubt, his guilt over his broken oath. He was now a warrior, a leader, a man fighting for his love, for his family, for his kingdom. Alara, working tirelessly in the castle's makeshift infirmary, prepared for the inevitable casualties, her heart heavy with the knowledge of the suffering that was to come. But she also felt a sense of purpose, a determination to use her skills to heal, to comfort, to offer hope in the midst of despair. Thomas, standing alongside his sister, felt a newfound sense of pride, a courage he had not known he possessed. He had made his choice. He had chosen to fight for his family, for his people, for his freedom. As the king's army laid siege to Westmere, the battle began. It was a long and brutal conflict, a clash of steel and fire, a test of courage and endurance. The defenders, though outnumbered, fought with a fierce determination, repelling wave after wave of attackers. Isabel, riding through the ranks of her troops, inspired them with her courage, her unwavering belief in their cause. She was a warrior queen, a leader who fought alongside her people, sharing their risks, their sacrifices, their triumphs. Gareth, leading the defense, fought with the skill and ferocity of a seasoned commander. He rallied his troops, repelled enemy assaults, and inspired them to fight on, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The battle raged for days, the outcome uncertain. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, the fields surrounding Westmere stained with blood, the air filled with the cries of the wounded and the dying. Finally, as the battle reached its climax, a critical moment arrived. King Edmund, in a desperate attempt to break the stalemate, led a personal charge against Westmere's main gate, hoping to breach the defenses and crush the rebellion once and for all. Gareth, seeing the king's advance, rallied his remaining knights and charged to meet him, intercepting the king's attack and engaging him in a fierce duel. The two men fought with a desperate intensity, their swords clashing, their bodies straining, their wills locked in mortal combat. Gareth, fueled by his love for Isabel, by his commitment to justice, by his desire to avenge the wrongs of the past, fought with a strength and skill he had never known before. After a long and grueling struggle, Gareth finally disarmed the king, knocking him to the ground, his sword pointed at the fallen monarch's throat. The king, defeated and humiliated, stared up at Gareth, his eyes filled with hatred and fear. "Finish it," the king spat, his voice filled with venom. "Kill me, traitor." Gareth hesitated, his hand trembling. He had the power to end the king's life, to end the war, to secure victory for the rebellion. But he also knew that killing the king in cold blood would violate his own sense of honor, his own commitment to justice. Isabel, arriving at the scene, saw Gareth's hesitation. She understood his dilemma, his struggle between his desire for revenge and his commitment to his own principles. "No, Gareth," she said, her voice firm and clear. "We will not stoop to his level. We will not become like him. We will show him mercy. We will show him justice." Gareth lowered his sword, his eyes meeting Isabel's. He understood. He had won. But the victory was not just about defeating the king, it was about upholding their own values, their own ideals. The king was taken prisoner, his reign of terror brought to an end. Beaumont, seeing his patron defeated, attempted to flee, but he was captured by Thomas, who finally brought his sister's tormentor to justice. The rebellion had triumphed. The kingdom was free. The reckoning of love and duty had been achieved, not through violence and vengeance, but through courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The final battle had been won, not just on the fields of Westmere, but in the hearts of those who had fought for a better future. And a new future had been secured. Epilogue. The years that followed the rebellion were a time of healing and rebuilding. The kingdom, scarred by years of tyranny and war, slowly began to recover. Justice was restored, the wounds of the past began to heal, and a new era of peace and prosperity dawned. Isabel, with Gareth by her side, ruled wisely and justly. She implemented reforms, promoted trade, and fostered a sense of unity and common purpose among her people. She became known as Isabel the Just, a queen who had risen from adversity to lead her kingdom to a brighter future. Gareth, his oath to the former king long forgotten, served as Isabel's trusted advisor, her commander, and her husband. Their love, forged in the crucible of rebellion, had blossomed into a deep and enduring bond, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and a profound affection. Alara, reunited with her brother and her niece, continued her work as a healer, traveling throughout the kingdom, tending to the sick and the injured, offering comfort and hope to those in need. She became known as Alara the Compassionate, a woman whose kindness and skill touched the lives of countless people. Thomas, having redeemed himself through his courage and loyalty during the rebellion, served as a wise and trusted counselor to Isabel and Gareth, helping to guide the kingdom towards a more just and equitable future. He had found his own strength, his own honor, in the fight for freedom. The wooden cross, once a symbol of a lost sister and a desperate quest, became a treasured family heirloom, a reminder of the bonds that had brought them together, of the courage they had shown, and of the love that had sustained them through the darkest of times. One spring morning, many years after the rebellion, Isabel and Gareth stood on the battlements of Westmere, looking out over the rolling hills and verdant valleys of their kingdom. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the land, a symbol of the new dawn that had broken over their realm. Isabel leaned against Gareth, her hand resting on his arm, her heart filled with contentment. She had found her freedom, her family, her love, and her purpose. "We did it, Gareth," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "We built a better world." Gareth smiled, his gray eyes filled with love and admiration. "We did it together," he said, "and we will continue to build it together for as long as we live." They stood in silence for a moment, their hearts filled with gratitude, their future stretching before them, a tapestry woven with love, loyalty, and a shared commitment to justice. The scars of the past remained, a reminder of the struggles they had overcome, but they were also a testament to their strength, their resilience, and their unwavering bell.